Thank you for tuning in for the next part of our series as we study through the first of Peter's two letters. We're in chapter 2. We are taking a look at 2 verses today in chapter 2. And what Peter does here, it's a lot like Paul. Paul in his letters, you can really see this as you're reading through a lot of his, especially Corinthians or Romans or Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, some of those letters where he lays out some good solid doctrine in the first part of the letter, and then he hits a point in the letter. I call that the hinge point, where things turn. And he starts moving into how we apply this. Peter does the exact same thing here. That's not to say there's not going to be some good solid teaching and some good doctrine in the latter part of this letter or in any of Paul's letters, because there is. But you reach a point where he lays out some doctrine, then he moves to how this fits into our daily lives as we live in this world. And that's where we're at in chapter 2 of 1 Peter. Peter reaches the hinge point of his letter. Verses 11 and 12 of chapter 2. Let me read it to you. I'm reading out of the New American Standard. He says, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the things in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God on the day of his visitation." So what we have here is Peter reaching this point where he's saying, okay, the first part of my letter is all about how we are living these lives of hope. We have this new creation of faith, the salvation that God has given to us. We have an inheritance. We have this forward expectation of being in eternity in heaven with Jesus forever. And we have all this, even though right now in this world we're suffering. We have some difficulties. We have some hard circumstances that we have to live to. And so in spite of that, and because of what we have, the hope that we have to live out our lives. We have to live out this nature of a new creation in such a way that it reflects the character and the nature of God. In other words, which is this kind of the theme of this whole letter of 1 Peter, we have to live out our lives in a way that demonstrates holiness. But the problem comes is what about the world that's outside of here? What about that outside stuff? How are we as Christians to live our lives in relation to that? How is our attitude supposed to be a different in spite of the circumstances, because of the circumstances, or in relation to the circumstances that we might find ourselves into? And so that is going to be the answer that Peter lays out over the rest of his letter. He's going to give some great information in a lot of different settings, scenarios, applications, or for how we live out lives of holiness in this world in which we find ourselves. And this next section is chapter 2, verse 11, all the way through about the middle of chapter 3. He's going to talk about how we live our lives in a daily fashion. He's going to give us a few different ways of playing that out. He's going to talk about how that works in relation to our spouses. He's going to talk about how that works in relation to authority over us, including governmental authority. And so he's going to compare and contrast a little bit from some ways to do so negatively and some ways to do so positively. And so he's going to give us this experience, this application of how to make sure we're living lives in such a way, what does he say? Our behavior in such a way that Gentiles, that non-believers, that people who don't share this new creation, this living hope that we have, this inheritance, yet anyway, so that they might, because of our good deeds, glorify God on the day of his visitation. They're going to see him through us as we live our lives of holiness. Now, this kind of teaching falls in the same kind of pattern as what Paul does. Paul, you might call it social conduct or relational conduct. You might call it the holiness code of how we live out in holiness in our day-to-day lives. Paul talks about it in Ephesians. He talks about it in Colossians. He talks about it in Titus. He gives us a lot of different ways that we live this out, these different relationships, our marriages, our parenting, how we relate to one another in slaves versus masters, which doesn't really fit our culture so much now. Some things have changed since these letters were written, but the underlying principles are still the same. We have to live our lives of holiness regardless of the relationship or the conditions in which we find ourselves so that people can see Jesus through us, through how we live. So he's going to talk about a couple of different characteristics that we have. He's going to use two phrases. He's going to use this idea of aliens, and he's going to use this idea of strangers in this world. And this idea of alien, we might hear it in a negative way on the news a lot right now with illegal aliens, with this immigration situation that we are facing here in the United States of America. We have as aliens, we have people coming in who are not members of this country. Now, a more positive aspect of that would be a diplomat. Somebody who leaves the United States to go to another country, England, Germany, France, wherever, to represent the United States' interests while they're living there. They are an alien in that land. Do they accept all the customs of the land? No. Do they submit to the authority of that land? Only to a degree. They do not reject their home country. They are living somewhere different, temporarily residing in a different place. So they are an alien. They have the status of being elsewhere. They're not permanent, and it doesn't change their citizenship. They remain loyal to their home country. Now, the second term he uses is the term strangers. This is pretty much a synonym with the first one. And if there is a difference between them, then strangers really kind of gives us more of an aspect of the temporary nature of this transition, of the stay that we have here that's not our home, while aliens expresses more of the status that we have, okay? So these two terms together, aliens and strangers in this world, bring out the fact that Christians are here in this world for a temporary amount of time. We are not permanent. This is not our home. We do not have the status of citizens here. We're here today. We're gone tomorrow. We do not put down firm roots. We belong to a different place. And if we don't belong here, then we shouldn't live as if we are citizens of here. Now, Peter's already told his readers to put off their sinful habits, to take pains to not live as if this were our home. And he's going to repeat that here. He's talking about abstaining from these different things. And so that's something that we don't want to dig into. We don't want to root ourselves in the pleasures of this world because our citizenship is not here. We belong somewhere else. We don't want to look indigenous to a world that is not our own. We want to maintain our status as citizens of someplace else. That is what this holiness that he's going to describe over these next 3 or 4 chapters, that's what that portrays. That holiness, the citizenship of someplace different. Because we don't belong here. We don't belong here. And the temptation, especially as we live here, we don't belong here, but we are here for a time, which means, and there's a couple different things about this, okay? First of all, that means that we can't just disassociate with everything of this world, because then we have no way of displaying these things that God wants us to display. We have no way of sharing our faith and reaching lost people if we just completely block everything out. So we're not called to live in complete isolation from the world. We're just not told to become part of it. The problem is that in our status as sinners, redeemed sinners, we once were part of this world. And now we have become citizens of someplace new, and so the temptation to go back to the old way of life can be immensely strong. And so what he says here is those temptations have got to be resisted because of their consequences. Because he says here, they wage war against your soul. The soul has been saved. Chapter 1, verse 9. But it is threatened by the desires of the flesh and is threatened by those different things that can tear us down and can destroy us. And so what Peter is describing here is something that is much broader than this. He wants us, his readers, both then and now, 2,000 years later, to demonstrate such a good way of life so that people see it and recognize it for what it is. There is a level in which good is a universal idea. There is such a thing that is good so that whether we are believers or whether people are not believers, they recognize it as such. There's an absolute. Even people who do not know who Jesus is can recognize that there are things that are good. And Peter says, eventually these people are going to see your good deeds and recognize it for what it is as coming from the Father. So there is a moral absolute that he's laying out here, saying that because of who Jesus is, because of who God is, because the way we live our lives for him, people who don't have that relationship, even then, can recognize that for what it is. And for us to live in this way is massively important. It might have we don't want these consequences, but it might have the consequences that the world looks at us. It says, in which they might slander you as evildoers. The world looks at us and doesn't like it. They might even accuse us of being criminal in nature. And Peter's not just drawing some ideas out of air around his head right here, because in early Christianity, a lot of these people were going to the Colosseum. They were being thrown in jail. They were being executed and martyred because of their faith, because the world viewed them as evildoers. And even so, what Peter is saying is we have to live our lives. It's a simple solution he gives us. We have to live our lives in order to overcome that kind of slander by living our lives with such a high striving goal of goodness and holiness that other people will recognize that these are false accusations, and he hopes that they will end up glorifying God for what they now recognize to be holiness and good deeds in spite of those antagonistic, slanderous statements that they might have at some point made. And he says that will happen on the day that God visits us. Now, whether that is the second coming or if that's the day of judgment, Peter's not very, very clear here. But what he's saying is that sooner or later, people are going to recognize that these things that we're doing have a source. They are rooted in our relationship with God themselves. And they can see and they can recognize that these come from God, and hopefully that will lead some of these non-believing people to put their faith in Jesus. And so that leads us back to that aliens and strangers statement. We are strangers in this world when it comes to the sinful nature of this world, yes. And yet, at the same time, there is a basic goodness, and we should try to live by that basic good standard that even the world will recognize as a moral absolute, so that we have the hope of leading others to recognize and submit to the will of God so they can understand the source and the ultimate fulfillment of that moral good that he's talking about here. That's where our holy living comes into, is concerned with doing good so we can be recognized in why we do it, not for our own sake, but because it points back to the fact that we belong to God, and people will recognize that, and they will come to desire to know him and to give him glory as well. It requires that we actively involve ourselves in the world around us, even though it is not our home, so that we can leave an impact that leaves the fingerprints of Jesus all over it. That's what living a holy life does. Does it benefit me, and does it help me become more of who God has created me to be? Absolutely it does. And that is a good goal. And that is a goal that I strive for in my personal holiness all the time. I want to become more and more like Jesus. But at the same time, on the flip side of that coin, my personal holiness has the desired outcome. That's what Jesus wants, is what I should want as well, of not only changing my life, but working through my life, through my hands, through my feet, through my words, through my actions, through my motivations, to leave the fingerprints of Jesus all over the world around me. And there's a lot of ways that I can impact those relationships that I have, or those circumstances I find myself in. Some of those are good. Some of those are not so good, and some of them might even be morally neutral, that they're not making an impact for Jesus, but they're not degrading anything either. They're just there. I would argue that probably that tends toward being more negative. There is no neutral ground. But even so, I have the opportunity of having my relationships, of having these things that I am striving to leave an impact on, and not leaving much of an impact or leaving only my own impact, or leaving an impact of Jesus on. That's where my holiness comes into play, and that should be my goal. Not just to change my life, but through me, God can use me and my actions and my words and my motives and all of these things about me to impact others. That's where holy living really starts to see the rubber meet the road, and we can get some traction, and we can see God really doing some amazing things. And so Peter is going to lay out over the next few chapters, the next thing he's going to do is going to go submitting to government authorities, the government that is instituted by God, as long as it does not call us away from the standards of God. There can be governments that are not holy, but he's saying that unless that's the case, we are called to submit. That's a hard teaching. I don't always agree with what our government does, and yet at the same time, I know that God has a reason and a purpose in place for what we experience all the time. His plan has to be 100%, or it's nothing. I have to understand that. He's going to go from there. He's going to go talk about submitting to our spouses and how we play out holiness in our relationship with our husbands or with our wives. And then from there, he's going to go on. He's going to talk about how we do that as in whatever circumstances we are, and be able to live out this holiness in all of these different circumstances. But he says, and he prefaces that with these two verses right here. He says, make sure you remember, you are aliens and strangers in this world. This world is not your own. It's not your home. It's not your final destination. There is someplace else that you belong, and that is how you have to live. But while you are here, you have to live in such a way that it makes an impact. You have to live in such a way so that people can look at you and see what Jesus might want to do in them. That they can see what Jesus is doing in us, through us, thereby impacting them. That's what it means, I think, to live as an alien and a stranger. In our next session, we'll pick up that section where he talks about how to interact and how to be submissive to our government in a passage that it might stir up our feelings. It's going to be something that might step on our toes a little bit, but that's okay. There's a lot of passages in Scripture that I know that if they don't step on my toes, I wonder if I'm paying attention close enough. This might be one of those for you. I don't know. We'll talk about it in our next session, but until then, just make sure you strive to live these holy, holy lives. So as Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, people can see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. What that looks like in your day-to-day life, I don't know. I've got some good ideas what it looks like in mine, and I'm going to strive to take steps to implement it every single day. Thanks for being here and checking these things out with us as we study these passages, and we will see you next time.